Hello, everyone. I'm Miss Gian, and this is our chapter one for Introduction to Psychology. So we'll just first define what psychology is, look at the early shapers, and etc. No, I'll let you know what we will cover today in the next slide. So this is the science of mind and behavior. So in this chapter, we will be defining psychology and its four main goals. As far as I know, wala pa gyud ni siya na usab ng mga goals in psychology. Then we'll also look at the key figures in psychology who shaped the fields and what fields they influenced. Look at the modern perspectives of the psychologist and also understand how does psychology conduct research. So under here, we'll look at mga methods in research, no, just a koan lang, no, just an overview of it, and also the ethical way to do research. So our first objective is to understand what psychology is and also the four ka-goals. So psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. If you ask any first year psychology na second year na ron, we all memorize the definition of psychology. Pero this is just short but heavy ang meaning ani niya. Nga naman, look at the keywords. Scientific study, kay of course, we're not looking at psychology just out of common sense or rationalization or logic. We have experiments, Judd. And we follow the scientific method, which makes psychology really a discipline or a scientific discipline. Just a little bit of information. Psychology was birthed out like over 150 years old. If you look at now, at the time of the video, we're 2026, right? So that's 150 years old. Compared to other fields in science, psychology is baby pa lang. Before, wala pa ni siya na-separate sa philosophers. And number siya nasa middle between physiology and philosophy. So when it happened, no, I'll let you know in the next few slides where it actually departed, no, really branch out into its own unique field and have this scientific disciplines. But that's it, no, scientific study. So di lang taba basta mag-observe then conclude dayon. There should be experiments placed, surveys placed, so there should be appropriate research methods for it. No, so we report the stuff that we've observed. So really grounded on science. And scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Now, what are the behaviors that we're talking about in psychology? We're looking at the outward visible actions. So anything really that we can directly observe. So if you see psychologists in a two-way mirror, kana bitang experiments na ang Picas room o sila kay ba nag-obserbahan sila, and then ako psychologist ko, I look at, for example, their facial expressions. How many donuts they're eating, right? If they're stressed, if I put them under stress in this control group and this treatment group, no. So I look at anything really that can be observed. Then we also cover, aside from that, mental processes. So anything that we cannot see. So if this one we can directly observe, mental processes are things that we can't see. It's internal, but it's going inside us. So these are like perceptions, attitudes. You'll hear those words over and over again, even after you graduate. Okay, very common words in research as well. Okay, so that's where you see now psychologists asking like, what do you feel when, right? Or what do you remember when? So for example, I'll give you an experiment. These psychologists tested out how well people really have factual memories. So they ask questions like, did you remember that there was a yellow ball at the corner at blah 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 street? And they say, yeah, I remember. As it turns out, there wasn't a yellow ball. So ang bottom line ani na research is they wanna uncover if human beings generate false memories. And they've uncovered that through asking those questions. So, unsa man ni siya? Sa behavior ba or mental processes? So when you're asked to remember things, you asked to infer about them, you're asked to think about them, we are looking the mental processes aspect of psychology. So, psychology is a science that looks at the behavior of the person and their mental processes. Yan na, simple. Okay? So let's move now to the four goals of psychology. So just kanang ko ano, just a little bit of information na dili ni siya kanang dapat naatanan. Dili po na dapat usa lang, no. Some psychologists when they're doing research or where kanang conducting research, they can both describe and explain, they can just predict and control, or they can do all four. But ultimately, here are the four goals of psychology. So number one is describe. So unsa day nahitabo? Unsa na phenomenon? What happened? You observe and note down the behavior. So for example, social psychologists, what's happening right now, no? Kibaw ka ang mga what we observe are that people nowadays don't want to get married, no? So sociologists and psychologists are kuan kanang observing na most sa ilahang mga kuan in istorya nila, they're really like they have a negative perception towards marriage, no? So this is just an example, but there's really a research about that. So that's describing the phenomena that's happening around you. Okay? And then if you go to the second goal, which is to explain why is this happening, why are now the psychologists ask, not the researchers ask, why do people nowadays, so after they observe it and note it, first kanang they have to kuanjod, they have to what do you call this? Patunay, they should have proof na it's really happening. For example, they've got their data. Do you like to, what's your perception of marriage? I say, I like to be married one day. I don't like to be married one day. So, nag-survey na sila. Butang talan pag-survey nila and then nakakuha sila na, uy, kanina population, dili gud ay ganahan mag-marry nowadays, no? Kanina age group. So, they ask, then, why is this happening? So, they seek to uncover it. So, this diri na ta mag build og educated guess. And what do we call educated guesses? These are called hypotheses. So theory building na siya. So that's explaining. Okay? And then number 3 is predict. When will it happen again? So anticipate future behavior. So usually aning mga ganina type of goals in psychology is usually example, they want to predict when do perpetrators street harass. Okay, so possibly mo na sila na, oh, pag tanaw mo sa mga research, they're more likely to street harass if they're surrounded by other masculine men as well, no? And then there is like a positive kanang bitaw gi ano sila gi what do you call this, kanang gi encourage, no, to catcall. Okay, so when they're surrounded by other men and then they're encouraged to catcall, that behavior happens. So they're predicting now when a behavior is more likely to occur, at what place, at what time, what's the situation. So that's predicting. And then controlling, the fourth goal of psychology is how can we change it? Now, from the word itself, control, I know it's a bit icky, no, na mag-control di ang psychology. No, what we mean by this is how can we change behavior na bati to something na ideal? For example, throwing garbage at the proper place. How can we encourage people to throw their garbage and segregate it? So study po na sa mga social psychologists. Also, as researchers that usually use this type of goals or have this type of goals are therapy interventions. So how can we lessen the hair picking, no, sa mga OCD, trichotillomania, may nga na, no, so mga we want to turn unwanted behavior into better outcomes. From our example a while ago, how can we make sure that kanang people or perpetrators will no longer catcall? So those are the four goals of psychology. So let's look at the discussion question for our learning LO1, which is the science of psychology, what's psychology, and the four goals. Now, I want you to think about smartphone usage among college students. So to make it more relevant, AI usage, if you're interested in that. How would a psychologist tackle it using all four goals? So how would they tackle it? They want to describe smartphone use or AI usage, or if they want to explain, how would they do it? How if they want to predict it, how will they do it? And if they want to control it, how will they ask those type of questions? So I want you to write it down. Any thoughts na you kuano. So this discussion questions are meant for active learning. Para dili na mo passively learning, no, just taking in kay malimtan na na siya. Okay? So hopefully you've interacted with this questionnaire. So let's move on to our LO2, our learning objective 2, which basically looks into the key figures and shapers of psychology. So here, diba I told you, when did psychology really is properly established as a separate scientific discipline? It's because of Wilhelm Wundt. Now, there's a confusion about Freud and Wundt, no, who's the father of psychology. Whatever it is, no, this is just like a title given by the common folks. But we consider Wundt as the father of modern psychology and also the father of psychology because he established the first laboratory for psychology in Germany. So that's in 1879. So what usa di gipang buhat sa laboratory niya. Iyang known for is really introspection. So what he usually do is, for example, he asks people, mubutang siya stone sa iyang in front sa tao, no? And then iyang ipa ask og mga questions, no? Just really run down through what's going in their minds. So he also believed that consciousness could be broken down into basic elements. And why is he considered the father of psychology? Because he split psychology from philosophy and biology in its own science. So when we say Wundt believed that consciousness could be broken into basic elements, we're talking about structuralism. So here are the two early thoughts of psychology. Now, Titchener is actually a student of Wundt, no? And he also thinks na ang consciousness is kanang can be broken down into pieces. Iyan ang gi-expound kang Wundt na kanang introspection. So sa day difference ni Titchener og ni Wundt, no? So si Wundt, kung mo place siya og actual object in front of the person or ipabutang ba na niya sa imuhang kamot, si Titchener, mo believe siya na just the thought process is enough. So, say for example, mo place ko og blue ball in front of you, and then I say, okay, can you tell me about the blue ball or a blue rock? So, mana mo what do you feel about the blue rock? Can you tell me kanang all the sensation you felt when you were holding a blue rock? Okay, so that's a question type na objective introspection ni Wundt. Kan Titchener, mo ask siya, I want you to think about a blue rock. Okay, so can you tell me everything na that goes in your mind? So mo na siya ang difference sa duha lang. Okay? So si Titchener, he expanded Wundt's philosophy and called it structuralism. Still, it talks about the basic parts, studies sensations and feelings, and focuses what on consciousness. Now, this happened in what do you call this one? Remember, Wundt was in Germany. So si Titchener, he is an Englishman and he brought it to US, to New York. Now, following this one is another thought, no school of thought, which is functionalism. And mo ni siya ang proponent ani kay si William James. Okay? Accordingly, si William James, dili siya kaayo believe, no? Bisdak pa, di ka siya believe sa structuralism. Para niya, it's not really, if you break down kanang consciousness, so consciousness is a streamline of thoughts, right? Dili man ani mo ma-break down. So para niya, ang important question is, an important question to ask is, how does the mind help us function? Focuses on the how question or the why question. Okay? William James, if si Titchener heavily inspired by Wundt, William James is heavily inspired by Charles Darwin. And in fact, this is very big and major influence of evolutionary psychology, which we'll cover in the next few slides. But going back, no, focuses on the why of consciousness. So if naglibog paghihapon between the two, I have here an example. So let's think of a car. A structuralist would ask you to take apart its parts. Okay, so rhyming, take apart its parts. No, look at every pieces. Ang manubila, ang ligid, ang door, ang bintana. Tanawa na siya tag sa structuralist, basic parts. Functionalists ask you, the it does, what's the function of a car? And how does it help you get around? Okay? Let's give another example na much more fits sa psychology. Say, fear, no? So if you look at fear, if structuralists will ask you a question, what are you feeling when you're fearful? You're walking at the road and then you're fearful. So, mo na ba muna, akong heart rate titaas, akong kuan manginig. So it's all the what, no? Ako ang heartbeat ni paspas. But functionalists ask you, why does it even appear? What's the function of fear in our life? Okay, so mana din ang function is, well, it keeps us from harm. Kay think tas two steps ahead. So if you're walking at the road at night, you suddenly feel fearful, then mo kuan dayon mo spark up dayon imuhang cortisol and very kuan na ka no, very mindful of your surroundings and watchful na ka. So any signs of danger, para any signs of danger makakuan na dayon ka ano sa gani maka paspas kag action. So mo na ang difference sa two, no, the questions they ask, and of course because there's different questions, different put ang ma-uncover na answers. And let's move on to the next slide, where we will discuss another early pioneers or early schools of thought, which is Gestalt and psychoanalysis. Now, before I proceed, mind you, this is not linear. So, dili ibig sabihin na si Wundt nag-una, tapos si Titchener, kato structuralism, functionalism dayon. Think of it as mushroom. No, these schools of thought sprouted in some parts, no, mostly in Germany, some in US and also in Austria, which is Freud. Okay, so they sprouted in different parts at somewhat the same time, no, somewhat the same year, and not really year, no, kalamrag ka ng time, yeah, in a broad sense, to oppose a certain premise of a certain school of thought. Now, Gestalt opposes the previous premise of structuralism and functionalism in terms of na para niya nganong i-break down manimo ang usa ka butang, kay if you break it down, that's no longer that thing. So let's compare it to an object. Di ba gi-break down man sa structuralism into basic elements or basic parts ang consciousness, no, sensing and also perceiving. Now, if you break down parts of a cell phone, you can't call it a cell phone. So, generally speaking, according to Gestalt, so Gestalt is a German word for configuration or an organized whole. So that's the movement in itself. No, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the the principle of Gestalt is, well, really an opposing or antithesis to kanang structuralism and functionalism. So human beings cannot be broken into parts because our perception, we see it as a whole. We see patterns as a whole and not scattered pieces. So if I show you a bunch of circles grouped together and and forming a circle, essentially you will not say these are individual circles. You will just say that is a circle, right? So mo na ang mo na ang argument ni Gestalt. And if I show you like a circle na ay missing piece na line, I mean na siya gamay na pahak, you would still see it as a circle, and you will not say na that is a curved letter C. 'Di ba? So, mo na siya ang meaning ni Gestalt. Now, kani si Freud, I mentioned right na psychology didn't start in one place in a linear fashion. So there are different views, and one of the views that rose is Freud in Austria, and this really is where psychology boomed. Why? Unorthodox kaayo ang ideas and arguments ni Freud with regards to the human psyche. So if you hear the word unconscious, you hear the word urges, repression, dreams, no, hidden desires, that is because of Freud. Now, at the time when you talk about sex and those and this stuff, no, it's taboo. Especially much of his contention involves may pagka incestuous desires, right? So of course, no, because it's so controversial, ni boom gyud ang psychology because of his ideas. And because of his ideas, a lot of people also want to oppose it. And so now we have neo-psychoanalytic theory. So we owe the growth of psychology to Freud. That's why even if most of his premises, his contentions are already obsolete, we don't kaya dili man siya verifiable. Not you cannot kuan it. What do you call this? Kanang you cannot test it out to find out for yourself. No, most of it are case studies. A lot of it iyan ang gi-burn ang notes. So in a sense, much of his ideas dili siya falsifiable, di siya considered as true science, but because naka-create siya movement, a bunch of people opposing him, but still rooted in psychoanalysis, ni-grow jud maayo ang psychology. One of which is attachment theory, if you're familiar with it, katong kang Ainsworth. Anyway, so si Freud, no, when you hear about it, psychoanalysis na siya. And mo na siya mga dreams. And ang iyang ni-follow, ang mga followers niya, which is nibuwag repod niya later on, is si Jung, no, Alfred Adler, individual psychology, and si Carl Jung, analytical psychology, which you will learn more in your theories of personality. And also Eric Erikson. Gi-extend yun niya ang theory ni Freud. You will learn more about Eric Erikson. You will learn him again sa TOP and also in your developmental psychology. Right. So after that, there is another kanang school of thought na ni-oppose largely with Freud, structuralism, and functionalism. Para niya, ni-deviate naman ang psychology sa kanang true science. No? According to Watson is considered as the father of behaviorism. According to him, no, the psychology should just be about observable behavior, what I can see, what I can note down in my paper. So, para niya, kanang ang consciousness issue deviate already from what psychology as a science is supposed to be. So very radical shift no to observable behavior. There are arguments na mechanistic ayog tan-aw si Watson sa tao. But anyway, let's go no a little bit of background with regards to the history of behaviorism. You guys know Pavlovian conditioning. So it started with that no. Watson read the works of Pavlov. So if you remember Pavlov's, he's famous for the bell and the dogs. So if you pair, so he's the one who actually studied reflexes. So when we say reflexes, these are involuntary reactions that, such as salivating, blinking, and things you cannot control. No, and according to him, you can pair it with a certain stimulus, and at this, as you pair it, you will then, example, you can produce the reflex using the stimulus, not the original koan kanang. Example, okay, to better explain it, no, there's the food and the saliva, right? The saliva, so you give a dog food, mag-salivate siya. Now, if you pair the food and the bell, so every time there's food, muring ang bell, and along the way, no, as you keep on pairing it, ang dog, just from the sound of the bell, mag-salivate. So that process is called conditioning. So that is actually classical conditioning. That's Ivan Pavlov. Tama na siya ang dawn of behaviors, a radical shift to consciousness and the unconscious forces. So, mura siya di-focus on one side alone. No? On psychology is a scientific study of behavior. Wala na niya giapil ang mental processes. So, yeah, and Watson also studied Little Albert, or very known for the Little Albert experiment. So I'll let you see a little video with regards to the Little Albert experiment.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
So as you can see, gipangahatag siya mga furry animals, those are rabbit, gihatagan po siya white rat, and wala ra siya, no? Wala ra siya nahadlok. Also the dog, no? So he's very curious. He wasn't fearful of it.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
Okay, sumadlok na ang baby, no? Kita ka, bantay ka na. Hilak, sige na siya hilak. Given a teddy bear, hilak po siya. Alright? So, the little Albert experiment was replicated by Mary Cover Jones, which is a student na siya ni Watson. Under the supervision of Watson, he replicated it and it's called the Little Peter experiment. So, unsa ning Little Peter experiment? Same gyapon na kan Little Albert, gi-condition gyapon siya to fear something, a white rabbit, pero nakakuan siya counter, no? Counter conditioning. So, gi-pair niya something good ang rabbit when the child is already fearful until such time na dili na mahadlok ang bata. So, she is rather the proponent of behavior therapy. Also, you've heard exposure therapy has roots to this one. So, in a sense, a lot of things are unethical, no? Especially in a lot of psychology research back then. But now we have strict guidelines, which I will discuss later. Speaking of, we have here a discussion question about the Little Albert experiment. Now, in today, it will not be allowed good. That's a nagyod, no? If you do that kind of study, you cannot replicate that kind of study already. Okay, we have ethics. So, why do you think it's not allowed today? What do you think are the problems, ethical wise? And how do we balance the usefulness of what we get from that research against protecting the trauma and the dangers, no, towards people? Because mind you, if you compare Freud's conceptualization of phobia, phobia for Freud is you're born with it already and you just spend your years or your entire adult life recovering from it, understanding why you're fearful of it. Pero according to Watson, as shown in the video, no, you just pair it with something for a child to learn to fear something. So there is huge kanang koadjud benefit in that kind of research. So how do we balance man beneficence from maleficence or harm causing harm to others? Right? So I want you to think of it. So moving on to our next slide, which is we'll be tackling about modern perspectives in psychology. There are 7 major ones, major modern perspectives, 2 of which have roots to 3 rather. 3? Or I mean all of them have roots to the major schools of thought, which were behaviorism, psychoanalysis, Gestalt psychology, also some of functionalist and structuralist. No? So when you say schools of thought, it's like a movement, no, in psychology. Now these modern perspectives have roots, have influence out from them. So let's talk about the 3 first, the part 1, which is psychodynamic, behavioral, and humanistic. Now sa psychodynamic, ni sila ang murag modern take on psychoanalysis already. If si Freud, during its therapy sessions, when undergoing therapy sessions under a modern, a psychoanalysis perspective, there is a focus on sexual experiences and sexual motivation. Now, for the psychodynamic perspective, that's already taken out. Kay, wala, as mentioned, these conceptualizations or arguments by Freud is not cannot be falsified, cannot be tested or replicated. So in a sense, dili siya gamit. So nagitanggal siya kay dili man nimo matest out if tinuod pa gyud iyang theory. So unsa di ay ang take on sa psychodynamic? Unsay lang gi-focus on? Well, the unconscious is still a very huge part. They still firmly believe that it is very influential. Also early childhood. Now they're focusing more on the development of the self, and now they're adding social relationships. So you can see that no, because Eric Erikson is a big Freudian, idol kaniya si Freud. He actually extended Freud's theory. Sani kanang the psychosexual stages, he extended it, and it also is more focused. It has more social kuan na ba, more discussions on social relationships sa tao. So next is the behavioral perspective. Now, these two, just a tidbit of information, these two are the major perspectives in the 1900s. Now, usually conflicting ilang ideas because again, as mentioned in the previous slides, behaviorism or behavioral perspective is largely dependent on observable behavior, what we can observe, what I can observe, what I can see. So now its beliefs, its premise and postulation is directly opposed to the postulations of psychodynamic perspective. So, as mentioned, no, we already mentioned Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov, who started the classical conditioning. Then Watson is very big on little Albert experiments, now focus on advertising. And see what in si Skinner is iyang gi-extend ang classical conditioning ni Pavlov and built operant conditioning. So if you don't know that, basically he argued na a behavior kanang can be the term is reinforced if it follows a pleasurable consequence. So that's operant conditioning. So in here you will hear reinforcements, or also known as rewards, and also punishment. So that's behaviorist, no, behavior perspective. And as mentioned, see psychodynamic and behavioral perspective, they're the major ones, no, that rivals. Now there's a third force that entered around 19 mid 1900s, and that is the humanistic perspective. What's the difference niya sa duha? The two believes that there's an outside force that controls much of human behavior. So for this one, there is the unconscious, no? Repressed memories in early childhood that influences the way we act and think. And for this one, there is a stimuli sa environment. There could be a punishment or a reward, or that we're conditioned, our reflexes are conditioned or paired by something. So there is an environmental stimuli which causes the reactions of our behavior, and this thousands of kanang responses, behavioral responses, constitutes our personality. Now, humanistic thinks that we have our free will. We actually have the mind, no, we can choose to direct our own lives. And in here, you will hear the word self actualization. Now, the humanistic perspective is different from the two because they argue that human beings are active agents in our development the self, no, development of the self, our interactions with others, and in the way that we make sense of our lives. Moving on to the other four perspectives, we have the cognitive perspective, the sociocultural, biopsychological, and evolutionary perspective. Now, for the cognitive perspective, as mentioned, this has roots to Gestalt psychology. So mainly, it involves also it was famous during the age where the computers were born. Kanang ko ano, dako na siya na kanang movement. So rather than looking at the unconscious or looking at environmental stimuli, now they're focusing on mental processes alone. So how do we think? How do we process memory, or how do we keep them? how do we do problem solving? No, how do humans do problem solving? And as mentioned, because it is a huge force when during the computers, the birth of the computers, it also sees the mind as a little bit as also a little computer. So it sees the brain as a kanang CPU. So mo na siya ang perspective sa cognizant. So disregard nila tong mga unconscious chuchu, mga ingana, no, and just focus on it. The mind is a little computer. Okay? And then next we go on to sociocultural. Now, what's the difference niya sa cogni? You're just looking at the mind, no, the mind of the human person. Now, for people who are or rather who largely believes in sociocultural perspective or practitioners under that is adopting sociocultural perspectives, believes that human beings are influenced not just with one another but also the larger cultural context. So where you are placed, so for example, you being Filipino has influence in the way that you think and act. So the gender norms that you are experiencing within your culture has an influence in the way you think and act as well. So more on focus sila anang mga social dynamics, cultural aspect. So say difference miss sa social psychology o cultural psychology. Ang social psychology, mana siya ang study sa groups of people, mga roles within that group, and rules of actions within that group. Cultural psychology is studying cultural values, norms. So when we say norms, these are standards or standards for expected behavior and also expectations. So you pair that together, that is your sociocultural perspective. So muhatag tag example, no mo sila hatag tag example ha sa unsay type of questions they ask if you're adopting a sociocultural perspective. So ang Pinoy is having this sense of kapwa. Can we see this in countries such as the Western people? Do they have a sense of kapwa? KAPWA. Because if you look at the English dictionary, you cannot see a direct translation of kapwa, no, or togetherness sa Western language. So that's the type of questions. Now we call that cross-cultural research. Now, is the sense of kapwa sa Pinoy? Can we also observe it in Western countries that has individualistic culture? Okay, so yeah, those kinds of mga research questions ang i-answer sa sociocultural perspective. Here you there here because there's social psychology, you can also see here mga conformity studies. You can also see power, right? How do we deal with power with regards to our interactions with other people and etc. Okay? And next is biopsychological perspective, or it has a lot of names. Now we have physiological psychology, biopsychology, biological psychology, psychobiology. All of these is under a bigger field, which is neuroscience. So it looks at now the biology part, no, and how it interacts with human behavior. Okay, so for example, our hormones, right? So biopsychologists would look at, for example, if they're interested in women health. So they would look at the hormones na naa sa different cycles sa women. So those and how do women react? If for example, naa sila sa ilang luteal phase, no, that's the phase before ka mag-menstruate. So what are the reactions ani sa by the eye? So if they're interested in those type of questioning, then that researcher or practitioner is largely under a biopsychological perspective. And next is evolutionary psychology. Now you can see this much in pop psychology on social media. Naman sila psychology says that if a man is like this, like this, like that, and so on. No? There are a lot of stuff online that is not correct. it has a much deeper context kumbaga. So what do I mean by this? When you say lang, psychology says that men prefer women who have long hair and kanang sani long hair because it's a sign of fertility. That is evolutionary psych. When you see and encounter that online, as a budding researcher and psychologist yourself, you need to verify that kind of information. Okay, because where did they get that information? Okay, but those type of questioning, those type of kanang kuano is under evolutionary psychology. So it is interested in the biological basis of behaviors that are retained even until today. So if a person will ask or a practitioner will ask, why collectively we humans see or like things that are sweet? Okay, and why do we don't most of us don't like bitter taste? And evolutionary psych would hypothesize na it's because poisonous things are bitter. So those who had survived no under the roots of Charles Darwin's natural selection, those who have survived has retained that gene who is aversive of bitter substances. So, mo na siya ang mga kanang type of questioning no and other topics na interested ang mga evolutionary psychologist. So, usually makakita mo ni mga mating studies, mating behavior of both humans and animals with regards to evolutionary psych. Now, all of these are not strong alone. So, dito maingon, cognitive pinakanindot, kay mo mo ka-explain sa tanan. Or social or behavioral perspective ang pinakanindot. We cannot say that. And in fact, modern psychologists nowadays actually look at or combine 2 to 3 of these depending sa situation na ilang gitry og uncover or depende sa research question na ilang gitry og uncover. So the best perspective I say is eclectic. You combine them to the situation where it suits it best. So I have here the discussion question for the last slide. I want you to think about social media use in your generation and how would the cognitive, social, cultural, biopsych, and evolutionary perspective each explain why it's so compelling. Okay, so pause the video, reflect on your own, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So let's move on to the next slide. And in the next slide, we will be talking and discussing learning objective 4, which is talking about research methods, right? So in psychology, remember the definition of psychology is that it is a scientific study of human behavior and their mental processes, our mental processes. Wow, it's as if I'm not considering myself as a human, but okay, so when we say that psychology is a scientific study, we mean that we don't just conclude based on the things that we observe right away. So remember, we each have our own biases. So say for example, I noticed something, right? So example, I noticed that in Filipino, in my household, women are more expected to do kanang household chores, right? The labor that's usually washing the dishes and etc. So psychology does not conclude right away na maogin na siya sa Filipino culture. Based on my own personal experience, women are really expected to do household chores. No, are have that sense of kanang you're obligated to do that, which is a form of gender role or gender norming. So to uncover that question, to uncover really if that's true, we need a proper process called a scientific method, which we've encountered during our grade 6, our high school, and senior high level. We follow these steps. So if there is a branch of science will always follow these 5 steps. Number 1 is to perceive. So what do we mean by this number 1? This is where you being a future psychologist, researcher, it's important that you have a keen eye, an observer eye, because you notice something interesting. You notice an interesting thing that, others without a keen eye can observe. So when you notice something interesting, you try to ask a question. Why is this happening? What's happening here? Okay, so that's number 1. You perceive. Number two is to generate an educated guess. A hypothesis is different from a guess because a hypothesis is in an educated guess grounded in a lot of observation, numeral accounts of people in the literature. Now, if I'm going to be very technical about it, and we're talking about research, you've done your kind of readings. No, you've done your readings. You've read the available literature. You've read the kind of meta-analysis. No, meta-analysis are combined research study of that particular topic. So you make now a testable, educated guess. Remember, much of Freud's theory about sex is no longer kana accepted nowadays because it is not testable. You cannot falsify it. So mo na siyang nawagtang na siya sa passing. So anything na dili ma-replicate, dili ma-falsify sa science is dili accepted sa scientific community. That's why our research questions should have an hypothesis that we can investigate whether or not it will support our hypothesis or not. And that's going to number three na step, which is to test out our hypothesis. Is it really true na for much of Filipino households, we have a gender norm where women are expected heavily and obligated to do the manual labor involving the labor sa household chores. So we design a study to check that out. And picking a design of the study will depend on the research question and the answer that we want to get. So, asa ako ang palagay, kamo pagthink mo, if you have that kind of question, what is the best design to get the or to test out that hypothesis? You can do survey. You can do FGDs if you really want something deep, no, to get it out, get a deeper data for that rather. Or you can do observation. Again, it will depend on a lot of factors. It will depend on the time that you have, the money and the budget that you have, and of course the type of research question as mentioned, your type of research question and the answers you want to get. Okay, so after testing it out and you have your data now, let's say lang na nag-survey mo, nag-ask mo a lot of women in different households, and you've concluded, oy, taas gyud sila level, no? They really are expected to do household chores. Okay, so your hypothesis then is supported by your data. Dili mo conclude mao gyud ni siya ang nahitabo na. The data that you gathered just supports your hypothesis. Now, it's important to say that because again, igana ka nitty-gritty ang research. You are the one who designed your research. Thus, kamo po nag-collect sa inyong data. Even if controlled imong biases, naagi siya some form of bias involved. That's why we say that your data supports your hypothesis and not generally conclude because that's a very strong claim. No? Ana ka na, oh, tanan yung Filipinos are expected to do this and that. Pero what if inyuhang sample naraday sa Cebu? Diba? So mo na siyang, when you conclude, you make sure you use terms that are not absolutism, dili ta magbutang as absolutist na mga terms, no? You will just say na your data supports your hypothesis. Nasa akong pagkuha og data, ni support gyud siya na taas gyud ang expectation pag-report sa mga babae, taas ilahang expectations to do household chores even to this day and age, especially in far-flung barangays. So ana mo. Okay, so you analyze the results objectively. Okay? That's why I emphasize that that word saying my data supports my hypothesis. And then after that is you report. And your way of reporting should not be very complicated just so you want to appear smart. Okay? A good research is understandable siya, inigbasa, even if a student is not enrolled in psychology. Meaning na simplify nimo ang words sa someone na interested in that topic, want to learn and apply it in their own lives, pero dili sila psychology graduate. And that's what we call, you don't have any jargon words, complicated words that other people outside of our kanang careers or outside of our field does not understand. So that's how you share your findings and others. So these are the 5 steps of the scientific method in psychology. Now, I mentioned that there are ways to design your study, and we call that research methods. We have descriptive, involving observations and survey, and we have experimental type of methods. So let's go first with the descriptive research methods. So first is naturalistic observation and laboratory observation. What's the difference between the two? Ang naturalistic observation, it's realistic. You're really visiting the place of that subject or that respondent. If you want to study monkeys, you go sa ilahang natural habitat. If you want to study people with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, you go and visit their houses. When you visit and you observe their houses in their natural habitat, in their natural setting, that is naturalistic observation. Now, if you invite them into a library and you watch and observe them in a two-way or double mirror, that is already a laboratory observation. What's the benefit of the two? This one is realistic. So you can really see what they're doing in their own kuan. But this one is kanang dili siya realistic because you cannot put a monkey and say that they like banana because nausab man ang setting. Naaman sila sa laboratory, wala man sila sa ilahang natural habitat. Pero if makakita mo na ang monkey ni kaon og banana diri sa ilahang natural habitat, kainon mo realistic gid siya kay wala ko any kuan form of control na gibuhat. Now, what's the disadvantage aning naturalistic observation is the control. When we say control, you don't have the control na naay other variables that would come into place. For example, another animal, the weather, okay? So you cannot also control if you're here, you're already a confounding variable. Now, there's already an instance na maka-affect na ka. Kay nakakita man sila nimo. So bali alien object na ka in a way, no? So wala kayo kay control when you do naturalistic observation. Now, for the laboratory observation, yes, you can control the confounding variables as seen here. For example, putang talag mga monkeys ni. Okay? So makita nimo dili kayo makakuan ng mga confounding variables like another animal or the weather perhaps. Okay? So controlled siya ang extraneous variable. Pero dili po siya realistic. Say mo, inyong question is, does a monkey like banana? And then naa sila diri and ikaon sila sa banana. Dili mo kaingon anang kuan siya kanang generalizable siya sa ilahang normal behavior gyud kay naaman sila sa usa ka controlled na setup. So again, when you're doing laboratory observation, you do have more control pero it feels less real. And if you're doing naturalistic observation, you're doing behavior in its natural setting, it's real, it's very generalizable, pero wala may other control. You don't have control with the extraneous variables. So next we have case. So case studies are the money favorite ni Freud. Okay, so when you look at case studies, it's like one person or one group of people, and kuan mo dig deep mo no sa kana na group. Okay? So meaning to say, you're not comparing groups. You're just really focused on that one individual. So this is usually for very special cases. For example, there was this kanang guy that got struck sa iyang head, right? And then, scientists are baffled about this guy's kanang abilities. Now, if they wanted to find out something about people who got struck in the head, example, they wanna test out the memory. Example, si Phineas Gage daytong guy no nasudlan og metal rod because of an accident. Naigo sa iyang frontal lobe. If the frontal lobe is responsible for decision making. Now, if you wanna test out, these scientists wanna test out people who had their frontal lobe damaged, how will they do decision making, or what's their process na in problem solving. You cannot do surveys with that. Okay? So imagine that is a very special case na kanang kuan investigation. So normally, scientists would really opt for case studies. So again, mga special cases ni ang mga case studies na dili siya feasible when you're doing naturalistic observation or kanang surveys. And going to surveys ask many people questions. These are the favorites sa mga undergrad na kanang research, no? And even sa kanang mga postdoc, etc. But hindi man na entirely ingon na, survey sayon mo ni siya, sayon na bati na siya na kanang design. No, surveys are good for its kanang sa di ka siya time consuming, no? It's practicality, good siya for its practicality. Aside from practicality, if you have sensitive questions that will really affect, if ako na ko sensitive questions about, say, what is your sexual desire, if ang experimenter dili man ka observe, di ba? Di man sila kaduog naturalistic observation. And you cannot also ask a couple, bring them in a laboratory and watch them do the thing. No, that's not feasible. So mga sensitive questions are really good na design rather surveys are really good design for sensitive topics like those mga usually kanang taboo, not really, in a sense baka na siyang complicated siya to answer if someone else is also listening. And aside from that, if you want to compare groups as well and in a larger scale, like you really need like 2,000, 3,000 respondents, survey is also the best option for you. Okay? Okay. So, moving on to the next slide. So, by the way, there is nagpabura kong music here in our kanang koan. So, hopefully, di siya mo seep through sa video, no? But anyway, let's move on to the next slide and discuss about correlation versus experiment. What are the difference between the two? Now, correlation is you measure how things relate with each other. Let's start first with correlation. So, what can correlation tell us? Correlation can tell us the direction of two things. That is it in the positive direction or the negative direction? So, what do we mean by two things having a positive direction? It means they're both going up, okay? Or they are both going down. Okay, that is positive relationship. What happens if there is a negative direction? So there one variable is going up, the other is going down. Okay, so mo na siya. Now we've been direction. What about strength? Okay, how strong is their relationship? Kusog ba? So how when we say strength, we're looking at the R value. Okay, so first and foremost, we want the correlation to be significant. So meaning it's less than 0.05. Your p-value is less than 0.05. So once we know that it's significant, we can attest there is really a significant relationship. Now we look at what direction is the relationship. So if I say exercise and levels of or perceive happiness, say. So if we look at if they are correlated with each other, we find out that it is significant. No, the two of them are significant and in a positive direction, positive correlation. Then that means the more you exercise, the higher your perceived happiness is. What happens if we see a negative correlation? So most likely ang R value is also negative. No? So negative R value, negative, say for example, 0.88 na. Okay? So, say exercise and symptoms of depression. Okay? Exercise and symptoms of depression. So, if there is a negative correlation, the higher your levels or your frequency of exercising is, the lesser your reported depression symptoms. That is correlation. Now, what can it not tell us? It cannot tell us causation. It cannot tell us that exercise indeed is the cause of your happiness. And it cannot tell us that exercise indeed is the cause why your depression symptoms are now lower. It can only tell us na as this one increases, so does this one. No, only the relationship. Okay, so if you see your dots going this way, no, paadto dito from like that, that is a positive correlation. If it's going here, no, kani siya sa iyahang x-axis pa down here, as rather sa y-axis pa down here, so that is a negative correlation. Now, if you see a cloud forming, meaning there's no form, good, no, it's cloud, that means walay correlation. So most likely, your p-value is greater than 0.05. Okay? You'll understand this more if we cover statistics na in the next few slides. you will encounter there is math. There is a lot of math in Kwan, and I'm sure you've already encountered this one in your senior high probably. Okay, so now let's go to the experiment. Before that, let's look at the trap. No, because this is like the kanang common trap of people ba na they assume causation right away when they're just talking about correlation. Now, there's a weird study that measures the correlation between ice cream sales and drowning. And they found that it is significant and at a positive correlation. So the higher the ice cream sales is, the higher the drowning levels. Now, does ice cream cause drowning? Of course not, right? So there is some variable there, a third variable we call Z, that could explain why they have a positive relationship. Could be that this study was taken during the summertime, so there will be a lot of people buying ice cream because it's hot. But also there will be a lot of people sa dagat, so a lot of people also equates to bigger chances of drowning. So ingana, no? So let's go now to experiments. Okay, so experiments. Now we have variables. Okay, so variables. We have independent variable, dependent variable, control group, and an experimental group. Now, an independent variable, an IV, is also termed as your predictor. Okay, and dependent variable is also termed as your outcome variable. Okay, so what is the IV? It's what you change. So, for example, exercise. I want to know what type of exercise has a higher effect with regards to my perceived happiness. Is it yoga or is it running? Okay, so here is the variable that you want to change. What are you measuring? Your outcome variable or your dependent variable there is, yes, correct, your perceived happiness score. Okay, so how can we make sure na this is designed very well? By having a control group. What's a control group? It's a group na wala gyud siya any treatment. Zero. Okay, so we have a control group and treatment 1 and treatment 2. So asa diri ibutang ang yoga ug exercise? Of course, diri sa treatment 1 yoga, treatment 2 exercise. Control group wala gyud exercise, any form of exercise whatsoever. Now, experimental type of designs can now tell us a cause and an effect. Okay, those are just really the difference between the two. So hopefully it's clear, no? And medyo katag lang jud ang pag drawing, but yeah, hopefully everything's clear. Now, let's move on to probably this is the last, is this the last discussion question? I'm not sure. Anyway, there's a positive correlation between study hours and grades. A student says studying causes better grades. What other explanations could there be, and how would you design an experiment to really test it? Because it's just a correlation. Okay? So, how will you design a study to really look at studying and grades if you want to determine its causation? Okay, so think about it. Maybe write it down. Then let's move on to the next slide. Okay, what are the hazards that we need to look at when we're doing or conducting experiments? So you encounter this one again in your experimental psychology. Don't worry. So we're just covering the basics. So we have first confounding variables, the SIBO effect, and also the experimenter effect. Okay, what are confounding variables? I mentioned this one already. These are extraneous variables. There is a third variable that's causing the significant results. Okay. So these are extra variables that sneak in and muddy your results. So katakong example, sa naturalistic observation, what could be the confounding variables there? Okay. If you answered miss the weather, the other animals going into the setting of where the monkeys were studied, you are correct. Okay, so any variable that will mess up your intended variables of study, your IVs and your DVs, those are confounding variables. How about miss if nag-research ko? O say for example, you wanna test out kanang is there a relationship sa imuhang age o imuhang kanang happiness, okay? And nakakita mo na kanang naay relationship. Pero with using some statistical tool, naka-find out mo na gender could be a confounding variable. So, pwede na siya, no? So, dili na siya ingon sa experimental, ko ano siya, quasi-experiment na noon ni siya, no? Uh, eh, to know about quasi-experiment, you can research on your own. I will not discuss it here kay it's, ko ano siya kanang, outside na siya sa basic or foundation na topic, no? But again, don't worry, maka-encounter po mo ani again sa inyong experimental psychology. Okay? So how do we fix confounding variables? You make sure that rigid inyong design, tight inyong design. Meaning, dili gyud mo allow of anything to contaminate it and nindot mo og controls. So, kung example, inyong confounding variable is gender, naari statistical tool to kanang to analyze it in a way na dili maapil ang gender as koan ma-taken out siya ba. Okay, so let's move on to the second one, which is the placebo effect. Now, there's a study wherein the or study ba to marag siya kanang prank man siguro na ginaan siya sa kuan na kanang alcohol to where in fact water siya. Okay? And that person started to act drunk. So the water there becomes the placebo. So mao na siya, no? People change simply because they believe they got a treatment. So this having a placebo group is usually makita na nimo siya sa mga treatment studies for doctors who want to study if a medicine is really effective. Or example, if I want to treat out insomnia and I have this like psychological intervention na akong gusto ihatag sa akong clients, mag-establish ko og placebo group, meaning I would make them believe that they are given the treatment. Okay, so they're given the treatment pero di sila gid ay to ang tinuod na control group. Really did not receive any treatment at all. And ako i-compare sa actual treatment group. And I will then find out whether these two has a significant difference. Okay, so that's now a within samples design. Ay within ba ka ng independent samples design. Sige, more on that later. Sorry, maka-interject ko kay naama ko a little bit of kuan about that. Anyway, next is the experimenter effect. Okay, so the researchers' own expectations nudge the participants. So, naay bias ang researcher now. So it could be in the way that they explain the research, ma-influence na noon ang unknowing na participant because of the words that they used. Okay, so that's why it's was I fix ani double blind setup, meaning the experimenter does not know asa diri ang treatment group and the participants also doesn't know asa dira nila ang naka-receive sa treatment. Okay, so that's a double blind study. All right. So those are the fixes, basic fixes and control for hazards na ma-encounter nyo sa experiments. Now let's move on to the ethics. Now we're down to the last topic and this has been established fairly early lang in the course or journey ni psychology as a science, no? As you can see in the research before and the experiments before, unethical gito ilang gibuhat sa bata. Ilang gipakuyawan, no? Most of the governing bodies nowadays would not allow that. Stanford prison experiment also will no longer be kanang allowed in today's ethics committee. So what's the premise of this? You're protecting human and animal participants. You need to get informed consent. You need to let them know they have the right to withdraw anytime if they feel even a little discomfort. Or even if walay reason, they just don't want to continue. That is their right. Okay? You need to protect them from harm, meaning to say, your benefit will outweigh the harm that your study will cause. Okay? So, next is you tell the truth afterward. So these are for for studies na kailangan og a little bit of deception involved to control the experimental hazards or the confounding variables. Or also, you can also tell them and explain to them the results that they got, and then tell that their information is confidential and also they have the privacy. And as mentioned, no, the benefits should outweigh the risk. Now, what are the bodies no that governs? We have the internal review board, and we also have the ERC, ethics review committee. Most of the undergrad research nowadays should or must undergo jud ERC or REC, Research Ethic Committee na siya sa uban. REC, ang uban ERC, no? Depends sa school, pero dapat naagyo na siya, di na siya mawagtang. Okay, kay a review board should really check no the ethical standards put in place for that study to be conducted. And for animal research, the same raman sad yun, no? If dili man gyud kaya na maka-research og human participants, they use animals. Usually ani mga brain research na siya. They use rats, chimpanzees, etc. So the goal here is to minimize their pain and justify nga nung needed pa magyug animals to study that. Why not just use other designs, no? So kung makaana ang committee na bitaw kailangan gyud siya studyhan kay mag-study man gyud sa neurons o chemicals sa brain, and then you cannot get a human being and open their brains. So mao man ay standards sa kana review board. So man siya man ang ethics sa psychological research. Right? I mentioned the Stanford Prison Experiment. Most of you probably have known this one already, but if not, you can search it on YouTube what it is. My other video lectures also contain what Stanford Prison Experiment, particularly the social psychology video lectures. So do your own thing and research what it is. And here's the discussion question. The Stanford Prison Experiment was stopped early over ethics, yet it revealed how situations shape behavior. How do we weigh what we might learn against protecting participants? Where is your boundary? What's your line? Right? Okay, so we're now at the end. We will now look at the key takeaways. Number one is that psychology is the science or the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. I'm sorry, would like to correct myself. It's not human behavior because psychology is also studying animal behavior, right? Number two is many historical schools build today's understanding. So, historical schools of psychology, remember, are Gestalt, behaviorism, psychoanalysis. Okay, those are the schools of thought, structuralism, and functionalism. Next, modern perspective each offer a partial, useful view. So, one perspective is not the best or cannot stand alone. Okay, next is scientific method and ethics are non-negotiable. Correlation is not causation. Experiments are the ones that can show causation. And also, think like a psychologist means you question assumptions. And, much of this common sense psychology is not really common sense when you try to gather data. When you are a psychologist, you first need to test your assumption before concluding, right? And that ends the video lecture. Thank you so much for listening and see you on the next video.